Hello, and welcome to Story Time with the Wolfman. Some of you have probably been reading my stories that I've been writing and posting on Facebook. Credit where credit is due. I have found recently a storyteller by the name of Martin Shaw, and he has ignited a fire for storytelling in me. So he's largely responsible for this. Um, in that he really brought storytelling to life for me in a way that no book has been able to do. There's just something really magical about um, oral storytelling and just you know listening to him with his accent and his hand drums playing the drum and telling these ancient stories with just breathing such life into the stories. It really inspired me, and I caught the fire from him. And so one of the things that he said, which really rang true to me, mm, was that it's good it's good to know where you come from, and that we're all indigenous people somewhere, right? So you hear the word indigenous people and you think of the Native Americans or the people who are indigenous to Canada, and you think, well, I'm not indigenous, but like indigenous just means that you're from here. So you are, in fact, indigenous to somewhere. Um, and if you go back far enough, your people from that place had a storytelling tradition. And so without doing the 23andMe testing and that type of thing, just from what I know, from what I've heard throughout my life, I know that I have a strong connection to Poland. And um, that a lot of my ancestors come from Poland, and so if I was indigenous to somewhere, one of the places would be Poland, and so that's where I decided to start. And I just looked up folk stories from Poland, and I came across this story called "The Dragon of Wawel Hill," and that story is what I'm going to tell to you today. I've taken it and I've told it to a few of my friends, and I've embellished it and I've made it mine as much as you can own a wild beast like a story. Um, it seems to be a friendly creature to me, but it hasn't moved in with me yet. So now I'm going to attempt to tell it to you, and hopefully you'll find it entertaining. Without any further ado, here is the story of the Dragon of Wawel Hill. Once upon a time, in a time before history, I should say, a long, long time ago, in what is now modern day Poland, there was a great king. So, this great king wanted to establish a new capital city. And so he sent his scouts and his advisors all throughout the land, searching for a good site. And he knew what he wanted. He wanted a hill that could be easily defended, because these were warlike times. Back in these times, there's a very good chance that you were going to have to pick up an axe or a sword and defend your family and your possessions. And so he wanted a hill he could defend. He wanted a river nearby for fresh water. And he wanted good, arable soil that could be used for planting crops naturally. These are the three main things that he told all of his scouts and advisors to look for. So they went all across Poland and they came back with a few suitable sites. And of all the sites that they found, the one that seemed the best was a place called Wawel Hill. That's spelled with a W. Wawel Hill. So they knew that Wawel Hill, the king knew that Wawel Hill had what he wanted, and so he sent his scouts back to Wawel Hill to make sure that it didn't have the things that he didn't want. So what did he have them look for? He had them go back to Wawel Hill and he had them make sure that there was no pestilence, no curses, no barbarian hordes, no evil things, and nothing that would make life there unlivable, no monsters. And so they went and they looked in the sky, and they looked on the ground, and they looked in the trees, and they looked in the land all around the hill, and they looked all over the hill, and they did not find any evil thing. So they went back to the king with this report, and he said, "Great, it's got everything I want, it's got nothing I don't want." But he didn't just take their word for it, because he was a good king. And so he went to Wawel Hill himself with 100 companions, and they went and they searched. And they searched in the sky, and they searched in the trees, and they looked on the ground, and they looked in the land all around Wawel Hill, and the king looked in the river, and they didn't find any evil thing. So he said, "Great, this is a perfect site. Let's go to work." And he was a great king. He was a rich king, and he brought in stonemasons and farmers and all types of craftsmen and everything that I don't know how to build a city, but everything that you needed to build a good city back then. He had the connections, he had the fame and the popularity, and people answered his call, people respected him, and they came and they all worked together and they built a city, which turns out today to have been the oldest known capital of Poland in history. This part is absolutely true. This is the oldest historical capital of Poland. But this was in a time before history, when things were just passed on by oral tradition that all this happened. So they built the city, they built a castle, they built a city itself with markets and parks and wells and craftsman shops and all of the things that you need in a city. And then they built a wall around the castle, they built a wall around the city, they built farms around the outer wall of the city, and they built walls around the farms. It was a well built, it was just a pretty, it was a very nice place to live. It was very prosperous. There weren't too many laws. The taxes were as light as you can imagine. The king barely took any taxes from the people, but the people were so prosperous under his good leadership that even with just the most minimal tax that you could imagine, the king's royal treasury just built up and up and up. And he turned out to be the wealthiest king that Poland had ever seen up to that point. And the city prospered and it grew. And as it prospered and as it grew, the population got bigger and bigger. And so one day, with all of their wealth, they decided to have a full moon festival. And they were having this great full moon festival. And they were loud, and there was drumming and singing and dancing and all types of revelry. And it was great. It was a big party. It was a three-day festival. And what could go wrong, right? There has to be a but in a story like this where everything is so good. If you didn't have a but, you wouldn't have a story. So this is where the but comes in. But back at the founding of the city, when the scouts and the advisors and the sorcerers and carpenters and farmers and warriors and generals that the king sent out to survey the land, and the king himself, when they looked in the trees, and they looked on the ground, and they looked in the land all around, and they looked in the sky, and they even looked in the river for all the evil things, no one thought to look one place. No one thought to look underground. And so, underneath Wawel Hill, there was a great limestone cave. And in the great limestone cave, there was an enormous, grumpy, sleeping dragon. And he was sleeping. And he had chosen this cave because when he chose it, there wasn't a human settlement around for miles. He chose it because the only sound there was crickets and the rustling of the river, the babbling of the river and the rustling of the leaves, just, nice, the kind of sounds that you would play on your white noise app to go to sleep. And so it was a very peaceful, very remote cave when he chose it, because the city hadn't been built and he'd been sleeping under there for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, these humans had built this city upstairs of his cave, and there was a sound of the festival that grew louder and louder until it grew so loud that it penetrated the ground, and it began to reverberate in the great limestone cave where the dragon was sleeping. And the sound sounded a little bit like from the dancing and the music and the drumming and the partying going on upstairs. So as you can imagine, the dragon woke up. And as you can imagine, the dragon was pissed because there had been no one around for miles when he went to sleep, and he woke up to find out that there were noisy neighbors upstairs who were basically throwing a rave, and he was not happy about it. So he crawled out of his cave and he shook off the gold and gems that were encrusted into his skin from sleeping on and inside a pile of gold and gems, and he roared in fury and he took to the skies. Well, he flew around the city and he burned all of the crops in all of the farms. Then, and I always forget to mention this part. They were having this festival in the city, and there were 3 parties. There was one party in the city proper for everybody. There was one party in the castle for the nobles, and there was one party in the throne room for the king and his inner circle. So it was to the throne room that the dragon flew after he burned all the crops. And he tore the roof off the throne room, and he reached in and he grabbed the king off of the throne, and he looked the king right in the eyes, and he said, "You, king, have built your city on top of my cave. I am the dragon of Wawel Hill, and this is my hill. And if you want to live here, then on the next full moon, you will tie a virgin to the tree outside of my cave, and I will eat her. And if you do this, nothing bad will happen to you and your people. But if you do not, things will go very, very poorly for you." And he set the king back down, and he reached in at random and grabbed 2 people. He grabbed a duke and he grabbed the fool, and he ate them both just to prove to the king that he was serious. So he flew away, flew back to his cave. Well, the next day, the king had to deal with all this. He was a rich king. They had grain silos full of grain, and they had more money in the royal treasury than any king had ever had in Poland before. So it needed to be dealt with, but it wasn't dire. This is how the king felt about it, this dragon issue. It needs to be dealt with, but it isn't dire. So first, he sent out craftsmen and help to repair the farms, and he called for. There goes the cat. He called for stonemasons to repair the castle, and he sent a stipend to each of the farms so that they'd be able to buy new seed next year. Since all their crops had been burned, they were planning on selling those crops and buying seed for the next year. He didn't want his farms to collapse, so he sent out a little stipend to all his farmers. So it was all going to be okay. They had the grain silos full up, and they knew that they would survive the winter. It wasn't a huge problem, but because it was definitely something that would need to be dealt with, he sent out a decree in all of Poland and outside of Poland that if any noble or knight, any prince, any duke, anybody nobly born could slay the dragon, that they would receive a chest of gold, the largest chest that they could carry for 10 paces. And so heroes came. Heroes came from all across Poland. Heroes came from outside of Poland. And they all came to try to slay the dragon, and they all did the same thing. They had their big muscles and their shiny armor and their sharp swords, and they charged at the dragon, and before they could land a single blow, the dragon burned them with fire, leaving nothing but ashes and boot prints behind. Even the 3 princes from the Red Kingdom, the sons of the Red Queen, they came, and they were clever, and they decided that they would all work together to try to kill the dragon. And so all 3 of them charged the castle at once with their shiny armor and their bulging muscles and their sharp swords. And the dragon just burned all 3 of them, leaving nothing but ashes and boot prints. And so this went on for a month, and the full moon was coming, and the king had to make a decision. And so the king had to decide, am I going to defy the dragon and deal with the consequences of defying the dragon, or am I going to sacrifice a virgin to this dragon? And he was a good king, and he was a good man, and he was a bit soft-hearted, and he just couldn't bring himself to tie a virgin to a tree outside of the dragon's cage and cave and let her get eaten. It was just too much to ask, and he couldn't do it. So he decided he was going to defy the dragon. Well, the dragon woke up on the night of the full moon, and he went outside and he saw that there was no maiden tied to his tree, and so he roared. He roared in rage, and he took to the skies, and he flew around, and he burned all of the farmhouses and all of the barns. And he found the grain silos, and he burned all the grain silos to the ground. And then he flew to the king's bedchamber, and he ripped the roof off the bedchamber, and he reached in and he grabbed the king, and he said to the king, I am the dragon of Wawel Hill, and you, king, have built your castle on top of my hill. If you want to stay here, you will pay the price. He said, on the next full moon, when I awaken, there will be a maiden tied to my tree, or you will have vacated this city. You can either leave, or you can pay me the virgin. If you do this, nothing bad will happen to your people. But if you don't, things will go very, very poorly for you. With that, he threw the king back into his bed, and he reached in and he grabbed the king's butler and the king's chambermaid, and he ate them both just to prove that he was serious. Well, the next morning, the king woke up, and he knew that he had a serious problem. So he did the little administrative things that he needed to do. He sent out the carpenters and stonemasons to the farms. He called for the stonemasons to fix the castle and to rebuild the grain silos. And he sent out merchants to all the foreign countries with some of his very plentiful gold to buy enough supplies to get through the winter. So again, his people are going to be fine. This is the benefit of having a great king. They think about these things in advance. They're prepared. His people are going to survive the winter. They'll have another crop next spring. Everything will be fine. But this dragon has got to be dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with now because they're not leaving their city. It's perfect, except for the dragon. And so he's already sent out the decree that all the nobles can come and try to face the dragon. And he sends out another decree, and now he says in this decree that anyone, nobly born or lowborn, can come and fight the dragon. And if they do, not only will they receive a chest of gold as large as they can carry for 10 paces, they will also receive the hand of his only daughter in marriage. Misogynistic, I know, but this is how these stories go. Don't take it too literally. I'm sure she was on board with it. We can only hope she was on board with it. Anyways, he'd get to marry the princess and become the next king of Poland, right? That's the main thing. Is the main prize here is that the person who slays the dragon will become the next king of Poland. So, around that time, there was a cobbler with an apprentice, and the cobbler's apprentice, his name was Krok, which is a Polish name, obviously. His name was Krok, and he was in the cobbler shop working on some boots, as you do, and the cobbler's son came running in all excited, and he said, have you heard the news? Have you heard the news? Anybody that slays the dragon will get to marry the princess and become the next king of Poland. And so Krok walked up to the cobbler and he said, hey, I know it's only lunchtime, halfway through the day, but I finished up that boot heel repair that you had me working on, and I have got to try to kill this dragon. What an opportunity. He'd become the next king of Poland. And the cobbler kind of laughed and he said, go for it, son. Go for it. And Krok went back and wrapped up his tools and cleaned up his workbench and left the cobbler shop, and the cobbler thought to himself that he was probably never going to see Krok again. So Krok went down to the castle, and he went to the throne room, and he presented himself before the king. And he said to the king, O king, live forever. My name is Krok. I am the cobbler's apprentice, and I am going to slay your dragon. And the king doubled over with laughter, and he couldn't stop laughing because Croc was not what you would. He wasn't a big guy. He was kind of skinny, kind of a pencil neck, um, kind of a dorky looking little guy. And the king had seen these big, muscly heroes with their shiny armor and their sharp swords, just one after another, get devoured by the dragon over the course of a month. And if the dragon was doing that to these heroes, then what chance did this cobbler's apprentice have? No chance, as far as the king was. So the king was just he was beside himself, and he just couldn't speak. He was laughing so much. And Croc, to his credit, was not annoyed, was not overly offended by being laughed at by the king. He knew what he looked like, and he knew what it looked like that he claimed that he was going to kill the dragon. So he didn't take it too personally. He said, "Oh, great king, live forever. I have one request that I would like to ask of you before I slay the dragon." And the king said, "What? What do you? What do you need? What do you need? What do you need to slay the dragon?" And Croc said, "I just want one single gold coin from your treasury to buy supplies that I'll use to slay this dragon." And of course, like I said, richest king Poland had ever seen, one gold coin was not going to unbalance the books of the royal treasury of Poland or scratch the surface of his wealth. So he reached into his pocket, found a loose gold coin, and threw it to Croc just like that. Well, Croc was not incredibly athletic. He didn't have the best hand-eye coordination, and he tried to catch it with his left hand, and it bounced off his left hand, and he tried to catch it with his right hand, and it bounced off his right hand, and it landed on its side behind him, and it rolled out into the hallway, and Croc took off after it. And the king chuckled a little bit more and looked around at his advisors, and they chuckled, and everybody in the throne room thought to themselves that they were never going to see this boy again. So Croc had run out into the hallway. The coin had done its thing, spun down, and then come still. And he finally reached down and grabbed it, picked it up. Well, Croc was not incredibly handsome. Croc was not incredibly muscular. He didn't have shiny armor, sharp weapons. But what he was clever, and what he was educated. And he knew a thing or two about dragons, and he knew a thing or two about chemistry. So he went to the market with his gold coin, and the first thing that he did was he went to the shepherd who sold sheep. And he went and he said he needed a big, fat sheep. And the shepherd said, "Okay." And he handed him a gold coin, and the shepherd went in the back, found the biggest, fattest sheep that he had, brought him up, gave him the sheep, he gave him a handful of silver. Croc took the silver coins, tied them in his belt pouch, except for one that he put in his right pocket. He took the sheep home, he butchered it, he skinned it, he cleaned it. He skinned it, he cleaned it, he butchered it, in that order. He prepared a meal for his aged mother and his aged father, and he served them the lamb, the sheep. And then he took the fat and the bones, and he took it down to the temple, and he made a sacrifice to the gods. Then he went to the chemist, and he handed the chemist a silver coin. He said to the chemist, "I'm going to need 10 feet of rope and some sulfur." The chemist said, "Well, how much sulfur do you need?" He said, "About enough to stuff a sheep." And the chemist sort of raised an eyebrow, but he didn't say anything, and he went in the back, and he got a hand cart, and he got 10 feet of rope, and he got a barrel of sulfur, and he brought it all back, and he handed that to Croc along with a handful of copper coins. Croc took the copper coins, and he put them in his belt pouch, and he tied it securely. Then he took the sulfur, and he took the rope, and he took the sheepskin, which he had brought with him, and he went on down to the cobbler shop, and he used his cobbler's tool to stuff the sheepskin with sulfur and to sew it up. It was his first taxidermy job, but in the dark, if you didn't look at it too close, it basically looked like a live sheep. But what it really was a sheepskin stuffed with sulfur. So then he took the stuffed sheep skin and he carted it down to the cave where the dragon lived, and he waited for sunset. The sun set, he snuck out of the bushes, and he tied the sheep off to the tree, and then he crawled back into the bushes and hid again. And then he would start bleating, making the sounds that sheep make. And it was pretty good impersonation, if he did say so himself. And the dragon woke up, and the dragon stretched, and the dragon heard the bleating of the sheep, or so he thought. And he came out and he looked and he saw that there was a sheep tied off to the tree, and he said to himself, maybe this fool king has come to his senses. Maybe they will actually bring me a virgin on the full moon, because it's only the new moon now, and already they've tied a sheep to my tree. So without thinking about it too much more, the dragon picked up the sheep and he scarfed it down. Now, when a sheepskin hits the inside of a dragon's stomach, it doesn't last very long. So it burned up pretty quick. And then the sulfur hit the inside of the dragon's stomach, and it burned and it burned and it burned and it burned. And it was just, the dragon was incredibly painful. He was in an incredible amount of pain, and he fell to his side, and he was writhing, and and he got up, and he was too distressed even to be able to fly, so he ran down to the river. And he started drinking to try to quench the fire. But if you pour water on the kind of fire that is ignited when a dragon eats sulfur, it doesn't extinguish it. So he drank and he drank and he drank, trying to quench the fire. And he drank and he drank and he drank, and the fire didn't get any cooler. And he drank and he drank and he drank and he drank until he drank up the whole river, and he exploded. And there was bits of dragon all over the hillside, and the dragon was no more. So Croc, clever Croc, crawled out of his hiding place in the bushes, and he went and he found a dragon bone that was so large that it couldn't possibly come from any other animal but a dragon. And he took it down to the river, and he washed it, and he took it back to the cobbler shop, and he polished it up. And then he waited until the next morning, when the king would be having his audiences in the audience chamber, in the throne room, and he brought the bone to the king as proof that he had slayed the dragon. And the king didn't believe what he saw. He had to verify it. So he sent his two best men, and they went and they came back, and they were true, and they told the truth, and they said, oh yeah, that dragon is dead. There's bits of dragon scattered from the river to the cave. I don't know how he did it, but the dragon is not going to be a problem anymore. And so the king had the bone taken to the temple and hung over the door. And to this day, if you go to the city of Krakow, which is what the king renamed the city in honor of the hero, Croc, who had slain the dragon, the modern city of Krakow, if you go to the temple, the cathedral in Krakow, you will find that dragon bone hung over the door. And you please Google this, check me on this. You'll see that this is true, this part of the story at the very least. I believe the whole story is true, but this part at the very least is verifiable. There is, in fact, a giant bone so large that could only have come from a dragon, hung over the door of the cathedral in Krakow, Poland. And so the king hung the bone, renamed it Krakow. They had a feast and a wedding, and Croc married the princess and became king of Poland and lived happily ever after. And that is the story of the Dragon of Wawel Hill, of Croc the hero who slayed the dragon, and of the renaming of the oldest capital of Poland, the city of Krakow.